Dean, what is it about the nature of reality that requires there to be anything at all? It always seems to me so much easier if there would have been nothing.
Well, if there's anything at all that's necessarily existing, so for instance, numbers. Some people think numbers are necessarily existing. No matter what, 2 plus 2 would have been 4. In order for that to be true, 2 has to exist, 4 has to exist. So if there are necessary things, then there has to be something. Now, some things, it seems like it's easier for them to exist than others. So maybe numbers, it doesn't have to be very much for numbers to exist. But traditionally, God has been conceived of as a necessarily existing thing as well, but a special kind, different from numbers, a thing that can cause other stuff to exist. And if you do have a necessary being who exists because necessary, because there's no alternative, and that being could cause other things, then you could have an explanation for everything that there is.
Okay, so let's try to disaggregate what you're saying. You're saying there are certain kinds of things in the most general sense, that are abstract, that necessarily exist, that have to exist, that there'd be no way for them not to exist, like the concept of a number, the concept of a 2, and if you had 2 plus 2 equals 4. There's no possible way that could not have been part of reality. And those are abstract things. They're not concrete in any way.
Right.
And so there's no way to get rid of that.
It seems to me that there are abstract truths which would have been true no matter what, and that require the existence of abstract things that would have existed no matter what. The question is whether a necessarily existing thing could be of the sort that God is supposed to be, something that can actually cause stuff to happen.
That seems like a big jump, to go from an abstract necessary being to a concrete being, which may be non-physical, but it nonetheless is a concrete thing, to postulate a God. And then you're adding the additional requirement that God is necessary. How can you say that a concrete non-physical thing like God is necessary in the same sense that an abstract concept like the number 2 is necessary? It seems radically different.
Well, it used to be that philosophers used to be convinced, 70 years ago, that nothing could exist necessarily because the only truths that there are analytic truths, and the existence of something couldn't be analytic. But philosophers have kind of loosened up about this now and admit that there are plenty of necessary truths that can't be shown to be just true due to rules of language or something like that. And the question of whether something could exist necessarily is now, I think, regarded as an open question, just like it used to be before the early 20th century logical positivist movement. Now, when you ask about something, could that be a necessarily existing thing? In many cases, the answer is going to seem obviously no, because you can imagine things having gone differently and it wouldn't have existed. Is this rock necessarily existing? No, because it didn't have to be formed by pressure and so on. Did this person have to exist? No, because this person's parents didn't have to meet and so on. But when you get to some things, it does seem to make sense to ask, are they necessarily existing? And one of them is the most perfect being. We have a concept of such a being. If the concept is a sort of coherent one, we can ask, well, would that thing, in addition to all these other perfections, have necessary existence?
Yeah, that's the so-called ontological argument, which most philosophers would discount as a matter of language.
Well, you don't have to accept the ontological argument as a good argument for a necessary being in order to take seriously the question of whether a greatest possible being exists, and if so, whether it would be a necessary being.
But how can you ascribe the same kind of necessary existence to a postulated entity called God as in the same sense as that you have to have to the laws of logic. They seem like so totally different in characteristics. That one that you're forced to accept, the other that you're just ascribing necessary existence to something that you'd like to exist.
Well, some people wouldn't like this being to exist. So it doesn't have to be wishful thinking.
What is it about God that enables you to ascribe necessary existence to it?
Well, if it's a being that has all perfections, and being sort of robust and unpreventable is a kind of perfection, then necessary existence would be a kind of perfection. So if something could have it, it would be better that it have it. It would be a greater thing. This is a point that Norman Malcolm and others have made, and I think they're right about that. The question is whether a concrete thing could have this kind of existence.
It sounds like what you're saying is that if I can imagine this entity called God with necessary existence, then it has necessary existence, but you're just taking this characteristic and putting it on something that you like. You're not going from the nature of the characteristic, like the number 2, where you're forced to say, I can't get away from necessary existence for this abstract object. In God's case, I'm kind of making up a definition of what it would take to have necessary existence and then placing it on this entity that I have God. Very different than a normal abstract object.
Well, there are ways to make God's existence, necessary existence, seem to follow from the very nature of things. So it's very hard to understand what numbers are, for instance, and other abstract things. Where are they?
Right.
What are they? And many people have thought that, many religious people have thought that these abstract things are grounded somehow in the mind of God. So if all the necessary truths exist and have the contents that they do because they're part of God's thoughts, well, then of course, along with the necessary truths has to come the necessary being who thinks these thoughts. So that is one way in which God's existing necessarily could just follow from things that we already would believe about.
So your argument says, okay, we know that the abstract objects have necessary existence, and so how are those necessary objects grounded? Are they just existing all by themselves? But if they're grounded in something else, and that something else also has necessary existence, so we infer the existence of this entity. Like a black hole, we don't know, we can't see a black hole by its very nature, but we can infer its existence by the movement of stars around it. So we infer the necessary existence of God because of the expressions of these abstract objects. Is that your argument?
Well, it's not I'm not offering an argument for the existence of God. I'm merely offering a reason to think that God would be a necessary being if there was such a being. So the necessary truth of mathematical facts gives us reason to think that numbers have to exist. But if these necessary truths are aspects of God's mind, then in order for them to be necessary, God has to be necessary. So it just provides a reason to think that if there were such a being, the being would be a necessary one.